It's time for Dirt Daily, and today Noob Sock is on the lift because it's getting lower gears, stronger parts, and the ability to do some things off-road it couldn't do before. In the form of an Atlas transfer case. That's right, today I'm swapping the old transfer case out of this Jeep for some beef. And in order to put a new transfer case in your Jeep, you have to take the old one out. I've already dropped this transfer case, and I've actually made a video on dropping the transfer case out of a JL before. So if you want to know step by step, you have to go watch the old video. It's really not too bad. You have to remove the drive shafts, you have to remove the cross member, you have to remove the skid plates if you have added skid plates, and then you have to remove the bolts that bolt the transfer case to the transmission. And those bolts, there's 7 of them. And there's one that lives right here in this corner that's probably the worst one of the whole project. This is the one that'll make you punch your grandma because there's actually a cooler for the transmission that mounts right here in front of it. It's almost like this is a religious experience. You'll be speaking in tongues or making up new words, as I like to say. But I finally got the thing out. This is a Magna transfer case. Jeep calls it their 241, though it's actually a Magna 1622C. I think it's MP 1622C is the model number for a sport 2-speed transfer case. It has a high range and a low range. Low range is 272-1. Not too bad, but it could definitely be better. This one's a little bit different. It has a 1350 CV style yoke on the front and a CV flange on the back. I replaced these from the factory style when I replaced the drive shafts when the first built Noob Sock. I went to Tom Woods and had brand new drive shafts made, and they're much beefier than the factory stuff. In fact, I think the way he described it was, when I asked him, do I really need to change out the drive shafts? He said, well, you don't need to until you need to. So I figured I needed to. So I changed out the drive shafts. I've had zero issues with them. And hopefully the Atlas transfer case will not require modifying the drive shafts. I'm going to show you how the Atlas bolts up to the Jeep. It's pretty similar, but a little bit different because there's an adapter that goes in front of the transfer case. This is designed so that there's a section right here that has a reduction box. That's what you shift when you get into low range. And then back here, there is a chain system that drives both yokes when you're in four-wheel drive. So, not a bad transfer case. They've been using the 241 style transfer case for years in Jeeps. It was owned by, I think, New Process and then New Venture, or New Venture and then New Process, and now Magna. So it's kind of been the same style. It's just kind of changed a little bit over the years. This one is actually almost brand new because when I swapped all the drivetrain in, this was a super low miles transfer case. But as much as I enjoyed this transfer case, I wanted lower gears and I wanted some more strength, and I wanted the ability to do a front dig. What's a front dig? Let's go look at our transfer case. This is the Atlas transfer case from Advanced Adapters. Advanced Adapters has been around since the 1970s, and they have been making adapters to put different engines in Jeeps and 4x4s forever. And then about 25 years ago, they invented the Atlas transfer case, which was basically a hopped up version of the Dana 300. The Dana 300 was the transfer case you would find in, say, a late model CJ, like a CJ7. But that original Atlas transfer case was bigger and beefier and stronger and every way from the Dana 300. And then over the past 25 years, they've been improving it exponentially. This transfer case now finds its way into race cars like Ultra 4 cars, competition rock crawlers, as well as lots of trail rigs and vehicles that are driving on the street. You can order an Atlas with 5 different low-range options. So I ordered a 3.8-1. Not as low as a Rubicon, but not as high as the stock transfer case. It gives you a good middle-of-the-road crawling ability, but also has some speed in low range. Now, you can order an Atlas with a 2.0, a 3.0, a 3.8, a 4-1, or a 5-1. So you have a lot of different options when you order this transfer case. Plus, they also make a 4-speed transfer case. This is just a 2-speed, high and low. They offer a 4-speed, that puts a 272-to-1 reduction box in front of this so that you have a whole bunch more options of gearing. In fact, you can get as low as I think 11-to-1 in the lowest of low range. So I'm running the 2-speed transfer case. I think that's going to be fine for what I do with NoobSock. Plus, it's not going to add a whole lot of length so that I can bolt this in. In addition to having all those low range options when you order your transfer case, you also have some performance options when you're actually wheeling with an Atlas. So an Atlas has a twin stick design, which means there's a shifter for both of these shift rails. And one of them will engage the rear and one of them will engage the front into high or low range. Now you can't have one in high and the other one in low, but you can have either in low exclusive from the other end. So you could say have the rear drive shaft in low range and the front is in neutral. Or you could have the front in low range and the rear is in neutral. Why would you want to do that? Well, you might want the rear low range as an option if you're towing something. Say you're pulling a boat out of a boat ramp and you want more gearing to help get the torque to the ground to get the vehicle moving and pull that heavy load. So, but you don't really want four-wheel drive because you're on asphalt or hard-packed concrete. So you could put just the rear in low range. Now, why would you want the front in low range? Well, the front in low range is an option for what they call a front dig. And a front dig is where you send all the power to the front axle and you basically use that, you turn your steering and you engage the front axle and you kind of work the brake for the rear. So you want to basically pivot the Jeep or vehicle around the rear tires. This is a maneuver that was kind of developed in rock crawling times. Competition rock crawlers have done it for years, and it helps to turn really sharp in a 4x4. Now, I wouldn't do that on a stock axle. You'd probably blow it up. But if you have a beefed up Dana 44 with some really strong axle shafts, or better yet, a Dana 60 or 1-ton axles, I'm pretty sure that a front dig would be just fine. I have tried the front dig with IFS over the years. It didn't end well. So I can tell you, front digs are a lot of stress on the front axle, but if you have a strong front axle, it's a really cool maneuver that you can do off-road that you can't do with a stock Magna case. Now, in order to get the Atlas into the Jeep, we need to adapt it. So the front of the Atlas has this bolt pattern, which is basically a circular design with 6 bolts. This one has a whole bunch of bolt holes. It allows you to clock the transfer case up and down if you want a better angle on your drive shaft or you need to clearance the floor of the Jeep or whatever. But on the back of the transmission, it's this pattern. So Advanced Adapters offers this tail housing which will bolt onto the transmission. It also has mounting holes just like on the factory transfer case, and then it will bolt onto the Atlas like that. So we're going to assemble this piece and bolt it onto the back of that 8-speed automatic that's in NoobSock. I'm under the Jeep and this is the back of the transmission. This is the 8-speed ZF automatic transmission. Probably, in my opinion, one of the best transmissions Jeep's ever had in the Wranglers. Behind this is where the Atlas is going to live, but you'll notice that this has an output shaft from the back of the transmission, and then there is this tail housing that needs to bolt up to this. This will bolt on with all the factory bolts, but then that output shaft is buried down inside there. So we are going to use this. This is a little spud shaft. It has a bearing that's been pressed on, it retained with a snap ring, and then this needs to be pressed into the inside of the tail housing so that the back of the transmission will spline into one end of the spud shaft, and then the other end will slide into the input gear on the Atlas. The tail housing is going on. You will reuse the hardware that you took off the transfer case with. So you're going to want to line up that spud shaft. I did put a little bit of grease in the spud shaft so that everything would line up, and it might kind of take a little bit to get it on there. And then there are 7 bolts, but that bolt that's right up in there behind this cooler, that was notorious when I was taking the transfer case out. the adapter tail housing is way easier to get to that bolt. So we won't be fighting it and cursing the way we were taking the original transfer case out. It is nice to be able to lower the transmission kind of down a little bit to get it away from the floorboard so you can get to those top 3 bolts. There is a steel bracket that was used to support the shifter cable for the transmission. This will not be reused because it won't fit over the top of the tail housing. Tail housing is in. I started bolting the cooler back in place. This is the transmission mount, transfer case mount that came off of the old transfer case, and this is designed to bolt right back onto the advanced adapter's tail housing. So when this is all finished, you'll be able to put the factory cross member back in. You'll be able to put the skid plates back on. I'm using the metal cloak skid plates, and they're designed to work with both the factory transfer case or an Atlas. So that's kind of a nice benefit of their skid plate design. Now we can mock up the Atlas. I bolted the tail housing onto the back of the transmission. I got it located in place. I even bolted the cross member up to the bottom of the tail housing. Then I mocked up the transfer case and figured out what the clocking should be. Basically, around the input on the Atlas, there are 6 groups of 7 little holes. They're all threaded. And then you have studs that thread into the Atlas, and then it slides into that tail housing, and you put a nut on each one. With all these different threaded holes, you have a lot of options for clocking, and I picked one that's basically right in the middle. I also talked to Advanced Adapters. That's the one that they recommended. So on each little group of 7 holes, you're going to pick the one that's in the middle and put a stud on all of those. Then I took this back and I mocked it up one more time. Everything looks perfect. So now I can prepare the Atlas to go into the Jeep. This is going to involve a couple things. We're going to bolt on a bracket on the front here, which will adapt the shift rails to the cable shifters that'll run up into the cab. Plus, we're going to put oil in the transfer case. It's actually way easier to dump oil into this when it's out on the bench than when it's up inside the Jeep. And finally, there are some switches for the 4-wheel drive light that we're going to have to bolt into on the back end of the shift rails. So we're going to prep this and then lower the Jeep down and get inside and tear apart the center console so we can put the shifters inside the Jeep. This is the bracket that bolts onto the front of the transfer case, and the cable shifters will run through here to the shift rails. Now, the bolts that hold this on, you're going to want to put a little bit of RTV on there and seal them up, because those holes in the transfer case are threaded inside so that oil can leak out. So you want to be able to seal that up when you put these bolts in. It doesn't take a lot, just enough to seal the threads and help keep everything leak free if possible. Next, you need to bolt this little threaded nut piece onto the end of the shift rail. This is kind of a neat piece. It has a groove cut in it, and then there will be a matching block that slides over that groove and a pin that drops into that block that locks it all together. And then on the other part of that block is where the actual cable will attach. So to start, this piece needs to be threaded onto the end of the shift rail. By having that piece on first and then adding the block later, it allows the cables to be closer to the center of the Atlas, and then everything is lined up and tighter underneath the Jeep. The way this is going to work is there's a groove in the end of this bracket, and both cables will slide into that groove, and then this piece, kind of this anchor looking piece, will slide over and lock those ends of the cable housing into this bracket. Meanwhile, the part that shifts in and out will go into those blocks that will slide onto the end of the shifters. It's a pretty clean and simple design. So Atlases in the past used to have all this threaded rod and rigmarole. This is a much cleaner system than what they used to use. So the next step is to put some oil in the transfer case. Basically, you want the oil about halfway up the sight hose when it is in the Jeep at the proper angle. It comes with 2 quarts of full synthetic GL4 manual transmission gear lube. You can also get this in bags. There's companies like Valvoline and Amsoil that make this type of fluid that is in a kind of a collapsible bag to help force it in there. Basically, you're going to remove the top of the sight tube, and then there is a dash 6 fitting. You can either make a contraption like I did, which is an old dash 6 fitting to a piece of hose to a little tiny funnel, or you can take the fitting out of the case and put the funnel right down in there and try to get it all in. You want to make sure that these top holes on this bracket are sealed up before you lean it over and dump fluid in it. The Atlas doesn't have an actual fill plug, but that's because people use the Atlas in different configurations in different vehicles, and they have it leaned different directions. You would think that with a built from scratch transfer case, it would have a fill plug, but over the years, they've just used this top hole for the sight tube. So that's where we're going to start dumping it in. This step does take a little while, but it's easier than if you're inside up underneath the Jeep. Now, if you have oil that's in a little pump, that would probably go in here easier, but you're going to make sure that you're using the full synthetic GL4 manual transmission fluid. I put 2 quarts of oil in the Atlas, but you might notice that there's no oil showing on the sight tube. That's because the Atlas is sitting level. Once it's in the Jeep, it's actually going to sit in at an angle like this, and as I bring it up to that angle, the oil starts filling up the sight tube. You basically want it about halfway up the sight tube. Also, when you're putting the oil in, make sure you remove the cap off of the vent tube because you need to let the air come out when the oil is going in. And also, don't forget to put a hose on the vent tube when it's in the Jeep. I've noticed sometimes, especially on earlier Atlases, that the very first time you test drive it, you run down the highway, sometimes it likes to spit a little bit of oil out until it finds its happy place, happy level. So if you put a hose on there, run it somewhere that it's not going to dump gear oil either inside or onto exhaust or anything. Run it to a safe place. And also, you're going to want it to go up high when you finalize everything, because if you're driving in water, you want to make sure that the vent is up above the water level. Let's put this thing in the Jeep. I read through the instructions and I was about to lower the Jeep down and work on removing all the shifters and the center console so that I can put the new shifters in. But it says that this piece right here, this is the cable that ran to the old transfer case, and you actually have to cut this cable. So this is kind of the point of no return. I'm going to cut this, and then the stock transfer case is not going back in. I mean, I guess I could get another one of these if I wanted to, but right up here, there are 2 grommets, and one of them has a cable going through it, this one, which is for the transmission. Don't cut that one. You're keeping the transmission, but this other one, you're going to cut and pull it back through there because the new shifter cables are going to go through that hole. So, safety gear engage. Here goes nothing. Fixed it. Hopefully, did it right. Hopefully cut the right thing. Guess we'll find out. I lowered the Jeep down and I folded the soft top back so I could have some light inside. And now I need to remove the center console. I have a couple things to deal with before I pull the center console. For one, this is the controller for the SDI shocks. It's actually mounted on top of the old transfer case shifter. Because I'm changing to an Atlas, that shifter is going to go away, so that needs a new place to live. The guys at SDI made me a 3D printed little bracket that's going to stuff into that center cubby on the dash. Now, most of you probably have power windows. I'm old school and I have crank windows. So I'm able to use that cubby, and we will mount this controller in that cubby where it's easy to reach, but it's also out of the way for the Atlas. On the passenger side, I've pulled everything out of the center console and put it in this box, including that radio. That's the rugged radio that I installed before that lives right here on the side of the center console. So I need to remove part of this bracketry so that I can get to the bolt that disconnects the center console, and then I can lift it all up out of the way. basically I just have a bunch of stuff to disassemble. I've disconnected the shifter, and then you're going to come in with a little flathead screwdriver and just pop this cover off. And there is a 10mm bolt. There are 4 10mm bolts. Two in the front and 2 behind in the back of the center console that you have to slide the seat forward to get to. You'll remove those 4 bolts and you'll undo some plugs that are underneath the passenger seat, and then the center console will lift up and out. I've disconnected the transmission shifter. I've removed the transfer case shifter. I've removed the 4 10mm bolts. You kind of have to pull the parking brake up, emptied all the center console, disconnected the bracketry for the radio. And now, I think if you, there's also a plug underneath here that is the little light that tells you which gear you're in. So we kind of you have to disconnect all these boots, and I think this will kind of come up between both seats. I think I've done it all right. There were 2 wires that plugged in underneath the passenger seat, and I think this all just kind of walks out of here. Maybe it needs to go back. Oh, I think there's a piece. Does this pop out? No, I don't think so. Maybe it does. I don't want to break all this plastic stuff. Oh geez. Maybe there. Ugh. Ah! That didn't sound good. It sounded like plastic breaking. I really don't want to break this because it's so kind of handy. Sort of have to push all this garbage. Oh, there we go. There we go. Oh, look at that. Oh, look at that. I'm gonna smash myself in the face with it. Did I break anything? Oh my goodness. Oh, this is disgusting. This is really gross. There's all types of garbage down in here. Looks like coffee's been spilled. This Jeep was kind of gross when I first got it, but I've never actually dove in it this far. There's like somebody's business cards down in here. All right. Next step, disconnect all this shifter stuff to put the new shifter stuff in. Come here, giant gross plastic thing. Maybe we'll clean you up while you're out. So there's 4 10mm bolts that screw down into this bracket, and then you can remove it. This is the bracket that holds the old transfer case shifter. And then you can just pull this out. That's where we cut that cable. So, junk. Then you need, I believe it's a 13. Yeah, there are 3 13mm nuts that hold the parking brake lever in place. And those will need to be removed. So you have those 3 nuts. Oh boy. I have a flashlight to see all of this stuff. And the parking brake has a little plug, so don't forget that. And then this piece can be removed, set out of the way. Now, all you have left is a bunch of disgusting dog hair, spare change, somebody's gross old fake fingernail. So I think now I'm going to come through. Oh, and here's like the wrapper for somebody's potato chips. And so now I'm going to come through and bring in the shop vac, clean all this stuff out before we reassemble the next part. Yuck. Didn't I clean all this garbage out of here once before? Check 1, 2. After fighting to get the center console out, I'm going to pull the driver's seat out. It's 4 bolts and 2 plugs, and then I can have that out of the way. It'll be one less thing to wrestle with in here. It's a little tight because I'm on the lift and the door doesn't open the whole way, but I think it's going to just slide out. And now I have more room to work. Everything is clean or cleaner. So this all had a bunch of garbage down in here, and I vacuumed it and sprayed it and cleaned it and scrubbed it, so it's better. This is the air duct that goes to the back seats. This is probably airbags. These are the cables for the parking brake. This is the transmission shifter cable, and this grommet right here is where the transfer case cable used to go, and the new ones will go there. Now, in order for the new transfer case to work, there's actually 2 cables, so I am going to spray some WD-40 down in that hole so that they will both slide through that grommet. That grommet was made for 1, now it has to accept 2. Everything else is pretty clean-ish, and it's about time to start feeding the cables down through that grommet. Next we have our 2 cables. These are the cables that will run from inside all the way underneath and to the transfer case. And the way this works is you'll push one end and the other end will move and engage the transfer case. Now, this is one of the cables. You'll notice that I marked it here and here with some black magic marker. That is so you know which one you attach which onto the transfer case. So like this one might control the rear drive shaft and the other one will control the front drive shaft. Also, if you look at from this layer here all the way up to these black grommets, you can see one side is shorter. The shorter side is the side you feed through that grommet and down to the transfer case. The longer side will attach to the shifters in the cab. So next step, feed this through. And you have to do it with both of them. And you have to make sure that you put both of the short ends through the grommet. So those 2 right there have to feed through that grommet. There we have the 2 cables running into the grommet. One of them is marked so we know which one will go to which. And you leave about a foot or so out. Now the next step is to go down below and install the Atlas onto the transfer case and then hook all the cables up to the Atlas, and then we'll come in and install the shifter as the final step. So for now we're done inside. We're going to raise the Jeep up and get back underneath. Let's put this Atlas in this Jeep. The Atlas is on the transmission jack. The cables come down through that grommet and then route up and over the transmission before coming back to the transfer case. They plug into those little blocks. I screwed them in, I put a little jam nut on each of them, and then I dropped the little pins through that retain them onto those little nuts that have the little groove in it. Then I used that anchor looking piece to retain the body of the cable shifters, the cables themselves, and that bolt is bolted in. I put a little blue Loctite on that bolt that holds that little anchor piece in and on the ends of the cables. So everything should be pretty good. I put it in gear so that it's in high rear wheel drive only, and that allows me to turn the input shaft. So as I raise it up and kind of wrestle it into place, everything, I can turn this and make sure the splines all line up. So I think the next step is jack it up and slowly line everything up and stab it in there. Now, this basically needs to kind of rotate. Let's see, lean it back. Slide this forward onto here. And up. Then this, ow, needs to, maybe this needs to come down. Can this come down somewhere? Yeah. I think that needs to come down and kind of rotate. There we go. And then move over. And then it has to go up. Yeah. Ah, come on. There. So I basically need this outer edge of the Atlas to come down so it rotates. So I'm just going to lower the jack. Uh-oh. Jack is stuck on the, there we go. There we go. A little bit more. Just about in. Look at that. Aha. The Atlas is on. Ooh, that light's bright. The Atlas is on the back of the transmission. Splines are lined up, cables are routed. I'm going to put a couple nuts on to hold it in place, and then we will kind of double check, make sure all the routing's nice. Throw that vent hose on, and then we can button this thing up in there. The transfer case is installed. It's bolted back on the factory cross member with the factory transmission mount. There's a vent hose that needs to be tucked up. You can just see it here. There's also a wire that will be adapted to some plugs that go in the back of the shift rail block, and that will tell the Jeep when it's in low range or in four-wheel drive. The front drive shaft will bolt right back in. You can just see these purple cable shifters running up over top of the transmission. The rear drive shaft did need to be sent out to Tom Wood's drive shaft to get shortened about an inch. So let's move up inside the Jeep and hook up the shifters. Back inside the cab, I put the parking brake back in and hooked up the cables. Here you can see the cables for the transfer case shifters. I put these little tips on the ends. Those tips will slide into the shift levers on this shifter mechanism, and then this piece on the back will lock the body of the cables into that, and then the whole thing will be bolted down in the same 4 spots that the old transfer case shifter came out of. There you have it, final installation of the shifter bracket with the cables. Both shifters will get shift knobs once the center console is back on. I think that's the next step. Put the center console back in, put the front seat back in. The factory shifter boot is designed for a single stick, but the Atlas has a twin stick design. The shifter on the right is for the rear drive shaft. You push it forward to get high range, bring it in the middle for neutral, and pull it back for low range. The shifter on the left is for the front drive shaft. You push it forward for high range, put it in the middle for neutral, or pull it back for low range. When you're in two-wheel drive, you just use the shifter on the right and push that forward into high range for the rear drive shaft. If you want four-wheel drive, push the left one forward and they're both in high. If you want low range, pull them both back or push just one or the other one back. I'm just going to leave it without a shifter boot for now until I make sure everything works. The Atlas is in, the shifters are in, now we need to plug it in. This is a control module that plugs into the factory plug, and this is going to tell the factory plug if you're in four-wheel drive or low range. So you have two switches that screw into the back of the shift block on the back of the Atlas. Those plug into this module. Then you're going to cut the end off of the factory wiring harness and put a different end on, splice a different end on, and that will plug into the module. And then finally, you have to run power to the module. So you're going to run two wires up the side of the frame rail up to the fuse panel where you can plug in and get 12 volts in ground. So this is just about the final step. We're going to tuck everything up nice, mount it high and tight so that we can put the skid plates on, and then the only thing left is a rear drive shaft. The Atlas is in noob sock. I have the skid plates back in, I have the front drive shaft in, the shifters are all hooked up, which are really nice compared to the old style. They go together really easy. The wiring was a little clunky, but I got it all buttoned up in there, and luckily, because I had to do some wiring for the transfer case, I noticed that the secondary battery, the one that runs the stop-start, which is kind of hidden underneath the fuse panel, there was a bolt missing that I probably forgot to put in, and the battery's like falling out. So I need to dig that out and fix that. So good thing I had to do wiring because I found a problem that otherwise I probably wouldn't have found until the battery literally fell out the bottom of the Jeep. I do need a rear drive shaft. I sent that out to Tom Woods to get about an inch of it removed so that it fits in there, and I'm sure that'll be back in a day or two. So that's it for this Dirt Daily. Noob Sock has lower gears, more stronger parts, and we're going wheeling. We'll see you next time.